Hey everyone, JJ Cooper, Geoff Pontes, another state of the. Let's start over. I heard something come through weird there.
No worries.
Hey everyone, JJ Cooper, Geoff Pontes, our final of 6 State of the Organization podcast. Today we're looking at the National League West. We are wrapping up with really a pretty incredible division, a division where the Giants, if you put them in another division, would be like we'd be talking about them kind of being really feisty, battling potentially, at least kind of in the cusp of the division race. And here they're fourth. The Padres are third, and the Padres feel like one of the hottest teams in baseball. The Diamondbacks went to the World Series last year, and I feel like we don't talk enough about how good they are again. And then we still have the Dodgers, who are the, year in, year out, the team that you just know is going to be there every year. They haven't won as many World Series as they want, as their fans want, but they are in it every single year. And yes, we will cover the Rockies too. And our condolences, Rockies fans. We can't continue. We can't put you in that same discussion there of these teams who just kind of are fighting it out, who are above 500. But Geoff, as we dive in, as we look at this division, I feel like this is the division where if you're not a Dodger, for every other organization, you kind of know going into it the uh, the depth of the challenge. I guess would be the best way to put it, because you have a team in this division that is what everything that Yankees fans, used to be, like the Yankees used to be. I should say fans, but used to be, where a team that had kind of everything firing on all cylinders on the development side and was willing to spend more money than anyone else. The Dodgers have had a plethora of injuries this year, but at the end, including to MVP caliber players. But you look at the end of the day, and it's not a surprise that as we record this, they're first in the division, because when you have this farm system and these level of big league stars, that's kind of where you often end up being, I would say.
Yeah. I think that's accurate. It's a very competitive division outside of the Rockies at this point. We'll see what they turn into in the next couple of years. But you got to deal with a juggernaut on top of, three other, as you described them, sort of feisty teams, whether that be the Padres, who consistently try to reinforce that major league lineup and try to win and compete with the Dodgers, the Diamondbacks, who made a World Series last year and still have an exciting young core, and then the Giants, who have been a fairly well-run organization, but as you said, kind of are an afterthought in a division like this, where you do have a powerhouse in the Dodgers, and teams that have made decent playoff runs in the Diamondbacks and then the Padres.
So we'll just dive straight into this, and we're going alphabetical as we have with all of these. So we start off with the Arizona Diamondbacks, who, coming off of, I would say, a very surprise World Series appearance last year. They weren't, they didn't look like an unstoppable force in the regular season. They did look like that up to the World Series. And you just look at this team, and you would say, like, I give them a ton of credit, even with what I would say is kind of some disappointing injuries, some setbacks on the minor league side. A team that has, and even has gotten kind of a rockier season from young star Corbin Carroll, especially the first half of the season, than one would expect. But between Marte, between Moreno, between still getting stuff from Suarez, Gerardo Perdomo being a solid player still, this is a team that, here we are again. They are right in the middle of the playoff hunt, and I would say that they have kind of some staying power here. When you look at, let's start on the big league side. Does this surprise you at all that they're here again, or did we see this last year and we shouldn't be surprised at all?
No, I mean, I kind of expected them to take another step forward. There's always a little bit of a World Series hangover, but they went out and they added some pitching in free agency over the last couple of years. This year they added Eduardo Rodriguez in December. They signed Jordan Montgomery in March. Rodriguez has been hurt up until recently. Montgomery's really been up and down. I don't think it's a huge shock to anybody, but that's the number 5 starter. And they have an ace, I think, or close to an ace in a guy like Zach Gallen. The bullpen doesn't really have a guy at the back end, but it's not a bad group. And then I think offensively, especially when the lineup is fully healthy, and you do have Gabriel Moreno at catcher, you're talking about Carroll, Kettle Marte, Jock Peterson, who against right-handers is about as good of a bat as you could have. They do platoon him somewhat. They got Josh Bell right now, who's hitting. They acquired him, or I guess purchased him technically, right around the trade deadline after the Christian Walker injury. Christian Walker has been one of the most underrated stars.
A revelation
in the game over the last couple of years. He doesn't get the credit that he deserves. And nobody hits against the Dodgers like Christian Walker hits against the Dodgers. That's who the Padres should have went and gotten. They would beat him every year. And just a solid core of players. Guys like Lourdes Gurriel Jr. is an average or better regular. Eugenio Suarez, who's now been hot now in the second half, was an astute pickup to them to kind of add a little bit more thump in that lineup. And they've gotten sort of a renaissance from Jake McCarthy, who I think had big expectations going into last year, didn't meet those expectations. He's now been a really good player this year. His numbers overall have been, I think it's like a 132 WRC plus. They have some positional depth. It's a good lineup. When they're fully healthy, they're pretty good defensively as well. I think it's not in a bad spot. And I think you look at the rotation, there's some pieces that are a little bit older. They do have some homegrown players and Brandon Pfaadt and Ryan Nelson, who have some runway on their careers. I believe they still have Eduardo Rodriguez for another year. I can't remember if Montgomery is an option year or not. I'd have to look at that. Maybe you have to, supplement a little bit of the starting pitching here going forward. That's probably the biggest question mark. And I don't think they necessarily have anything outside of like number 5, number 6 starters and guys like Slade Ciccone, Gilbert Diaz, who's interesting, but I think at this point you'd be happy if he's a number 5 next year for you. And others that are on the 40-man roster. Christian Maine is one who's injured. Tommy Henry's another that's kind of just like a depth starter. It's a matter of maybe adding another starter or two, but they've shown the ability to go out into free agency and get a couple of veteran starters. We saw it last year. I think how this kind of comes together again, and if they kind of strike that accord that they had last year when they were really hot in the first half of the season, kind of hit a lull in July, early August, and then caught fire again into the playoffs and make that sort of unexpected run to the World Series. Some of it is this offense goes and this team goes, as Corbin Carroll goes. It's not a surprise as he's started to get a little bit hot that they've started to turn a corner a little bit. I think there's other pieces here, but they do need that guy to be who he was last year, where he looked like one of the future superstars of the game, an all-around exciting talent that, can make a big difference in the base paths, putting the ball in play, hitting for power, just doing sort of all the things that Corbin Carroll can do. And I don't know if it's just a swing mechanics thing, if it's been an injury thing, if it's been a combination of the two. But it hasn't been a great year. He's starting to turn it on a little bit more now. But I think we're still kind of waiting for him to find that other gear. So the fact that they're where they are with Carroll having about as awful of a year as you could anticipate, I think people were looking at this guy as like a top 10 offensive player coming into the game. Certainly on the fantasy side of things, he was drafted in the top 5 almost universally in most drafts alongside some of the biggest stars in the game. And it was justified based on his rookie season. If he gets back to that in 2025, I think this is a team that could potentially compete with the Dodgers. They don't have the star power, but they have a really good team. And, they maybe have that guy there with one of the best young catchers in baseball in Gabriel Moreno that I know for a fact that Blue Jays organization curses that trade. Varsho's been a fine player, but that's a franchise sort of catcher, maybe isn't going to put up the biggest numbers, but just his overall impact on the pitching staff, defensively, the game in general, his ability to put the ball in play consistently, not strike out, stretch that lineup a little bit. He's a really important real life baseball player.
At the minor league level, I would say that this has been kind of a very frustrating year in some ways. And probably most importantly, if you said before the year that Jordan Lawler would have 11 games played in mid-August because of injuries, you would know right away. It's been a lost season for Lawler. And I can't emphasize enough how important that is, because this is a guy who should be big league ready and should be an impact big leaguer. I mean, you're talking about one of the best prospects in the game who's just barely played this year. And by the way, this is it's not the first year that he's had kind of significant injuries. There are concerns there. obviously with that. We'll get to some of the Tommy Troys and all in a minute, but the thing that does jump out is that they've also had a lot of kind of very good, very positive stories on the minor league side. You mentioned Gilbert. Gilbert is they've had Diaz has made it to the majors this year for them, which I would say that Gilbert Diaz making it to the majors is already a success story for this year, considering where he started the year now. And let's see where he goes next year. But okay, that's a success story. Davidson De Los Santos, who they ended up trading at the deadline, they cashed out on that, but at the same time was having one of the best seasons in the minors this year and really had kind of taken a step forward. You go like Adrian Del Castillo, who's made a very strong big league debut. This is a guy who was considered coming into his draft year one of the best draft prospects in that class, and then his draft year was pretty atrocious.
That's the word I was going to use.
Yeah, I mean, let's just be honest, it was atrocious. And so what I was going to say with that, though, is the year he's had this year, this isn't a where did this guy come from? This is a guy who's had that in there and had to kind of refine it, had to rediscover it. Demetrio Crisantes, who's much further away, but I would say is very much a guy who's kind of on the radar and kind of added to where his prospect status is. They've got a lot of guys like that where it's like, okay, so there have been these success stories, which kind of make up for Jordan Lawler missing almost the entire year. Tommy Troy has been, I'll ask you, I'll kind of kick that one to you because I'm just shocked at kind of how kind of unimpressive his season has been, to be honest.
Yeah, I've been shocked at how bad he's frankly been. In a lot of ways, it kind of reminds me of the fall off of Nick Gonzalez, a guy who was really productive on the Cape, showed the ability to hit for power. He always chased a little bit. There was always some swing and miss. But when you're talking about a guy like this who has the high level college experience that he had facing high A pitching, you expect him to be way more productive than this. And under the hood, it's not great. It's a decent contact rate. In zone miss is like 22%, which is not great. You expect a little bit better from a guy like this. He chases a little bit, but it's reasonable. The EVs have been down. I think it's like a 101.5 90th percentile. That's not super exciting. He was a guy that didn't hit a lot of ground balls, knew how to elevate the ball. His line drive plus fly ball percentage is under 50%. So the angles haven't been great either. Looking at like bat speed grades and contact grades and some of those things, and particularly ball flight, all of it's below average to, poor, like 40 to 30 grade type of metrics. That's not great to see because this is not a guy that was billed as an all-around tooled up player. This is a hitter, very similar to what we saw with like Nick Gonzalez, what we talked about in the NL Central podcast with Tamari Johnson. This was someone we expected him to come into pro ball and hit the ground running. The difference between him and Matt Shaw, in the summer of 2022 was very close. There was a lot of debate as to whether it was Troy or it was Shaw that was the better prospect. And they were kind of similar infielders that probably weren't going to stick at shortstop, offensive driven profiles, maybe a little bit more speed with Shaw. I thought there might be a little more power with Troy. It's been the complete opposite. I mean, it's been Matt Shaw in a landslide. And if I remember correctly, Troy was actually drafted ahead of Shaw by a couple of picks in that 23 draft. So the expectations were there that this was going to be a fast moving type of prospect. And he just has not been that at all. It's been about
Troy was one pick. Well, yeah. Just to interrupt, Troy was one pick ahead. It was 12 and 13. Go. So yeah.
Yeah, so he was taking a pick ahead. The bonuses was a little bit higher for Shaw, but within shouting distance of each other. I just don't know what to say with Troy because it really hasn't clicked and he really hasn't hit. And it's been, like I said, it's been about as bad as it could possibly be. That if you give me like what is like good, indifferent, and like awful before the season, this falls squarely into the awful category for Tommy Troy, and that's unfortunate.
if you're putting a caveat to it, he did have a foot injury last year that he had surgery on in the offseason. He had a hamstring injury early this year that slowed his start. But at the same time, he's been back on the field for well over a month now. And, it's still really a struggle in the Northwest League. It has been kind of a bounce back season for Drew Jones. I will say that's with some caveats to me, though. Like, it is in Troy's case, it makes perfect sense, but Troy's still being in high A. Here we are in August, a year after he was drafted, kind of is just kind of jumps out, because when you say that, it's like, okay, well, the guys who are picked around him, Nolan Schanuel's picked ahead of him. Nolan Schanuel's been in the big leagues now it's the Angels. It's been in the big leagues for a long time, but it's the Angels. So let's throw that out. Okay, Matt Shaw taken right after him. Matt Shaw's in AAA now. Kyle Teal taken the next pick after that. Kyle Teal's in AAA now. Enrique Bradfield taken several spots after him. Bradfield's now in AA. To be in high A at this point is telling you that there are, in addition to the statistics, there are some concerns there. That's where I would say that the thing that jumps out with Drew Jones, where I'm still a little worried, having a very solid season, he's making improvements about being able to hit the ball, pull the ball in the air, which was really still hits way too many ground balls and way too many, still struggles to kind of get the ball in the air to the pull side, which you're kind of is a vital part of being a hitter in the 2020s. But the thing that really does jump out is that when you look at it and say, okay, the fact that I know he had injuries, I know he's battled injuries, but the fact that the D-backs feel like he needs to still be in low A in August of 2024 as a 2022 draftee is concerning, because, again, when we just look at the other players from that draft class, Jackson Holliday is a special case. Let's throw him out. But when you look at, the Cole Youngs of the world, the Cam Colliers, the Jet Williams, the guys who I would say are kind of his Mikey Romero, like the other high school guys from that class, Xavier Isaac. You can look at the other high schools from Sal Stewart. None of these guys are in low A at this point. That's something that does kind of jump out. That is, I would say, at least a little bit of a cause for concern and a cause for kind of caution here for that. But I would say, again, I want to end this on a little bit more positive on the D-backs, but they have had a number of these success stories as well, where you look at it and say, okay, there are a number of guys here, and this is a team that's been, again, very, is right in the thick of it at the big league level. And that's something to be kind of encouraged by as well, which segues us to the team that is not in the thick of it at the big league level and has not been for a while, which, Jeff, is the Colorado Rockies. And I think you do this system for us. I think we like the depth of this. We like kind of the top end talent in the system, but I also feel like that this is a team, if all the, to use a really bad poker analogy, but if all the teams are sitting there, at the table, the Rockies are the one right now that basically they're looking and they're waiting for the flop, and they need three things to go right for them. They need, like, they're waiting. They're sitting there holding like a 2 and a 7 of clubs, and they're hoping that, the flop is going to be 3, 4, or 5. I'm sorry, 3 and a 7 of clubs, and they're hoping it's going to be 4, 5, 6 of clubs. Hey, we're in really good shape. They need a lot of things to go well here, just because they're so far behind everyone else in this division. Is there this kind of potential in the farm system right now?
I think there is. I honestly, like, depending upon how you feel about Charlie Condon, I think that this guy can hit. Arguably the best college player in a very stacked college draft at the top. I think people can look at Condon's power and really dream on it at Colorado and in Coors Field. But behind that, they have a really interesting system. There's a lot of talent within the system. And they're an organization that doesn't trade prospects ever, pretty much. So these guys are probably all going to be Rockies within a few years. Things went well early for Jordan Beck, didn't go so early later. It's kind of the same story with Zach Veen. Adel Amador has just had a really discombobulated season, but there's been some things to like in terms of, his tools running. I think the defense is better than it was built coming into the year. They've gotten a really good year. This is funny to say with the Rockies, but from a pitching perspective, they have some hope now, and they probably have the highest upside pitcher in their organization that they've had dating back to John Gray and Chase Dollander, who looks every bit the top prospect that we thought he was heading into the draft that year. Was he surpassed by Paul Skeens? Sure. But at this point, I think you probably take Dollander over Rhett Lauder. Just in terms of
do that. Would not take him over Skeens. I think we could also agree on
I
that
wouldn't
one.
take him over Skeens. I said Rhett Lauder. But Rhett Lauder, I mean, Skeens surpassed him. That's not even a question. But you'd take him over Rhett Lauder, I think, right now, just in terms of what he can project to be. You remove the Colorado bias from the situation. It's a great fastball. It's a really good slider. It's a good curveball. He's now in Double-A. He's pitched well. He gets tons of swings and misses on that fastball. And then you look throughout the top 10. Robert Kalaz is a really interesting young player. Hit his first full season home run actually yesterday. Carson Palmquist has had one of the best seasons statistically in Double-A. Certainly, I think the best overall season of any pitcher who's spent the season or a chunk of it in the Eastern League. I think he's up in Triple-A now. Interesting players like Cole Carrig, kind of a little bit later down the list. Sean Sullivan's had a really good year. I heard somebody say it, but I think you can look at this organization and look at the pitching in particular and say they have maybe a future rotation here. We don't know how good it's going to be in Colorado. It's a tough place to pitch, but they have a lot more of a varied system and talent depth than they've had in years. They have a bunch of outfielders that are interesting. They got a bunch of infielders in Dollander, Amador, Sterling Thompson, who are interesting players. They got, a top catching prospect that I think is still really good defensively, has shown some spark with the bat, in Drew Romo. And then a guy, Cole Carrig, who actually won in our best tools voting, won the most exciting player in the Northwest League. Granted, there's 6 teams, but Carrick's a really exciting player. He can play virtually every position on the field. He's caught. He's played shortstop. He's a standout center fielder that won best defensive outfielder in the Northwest League. He's even pitched a little bit in college, though I don't think that that's something he's going to do as a professional, if ever, outside of coming in once in a while. He's a really tooled up player. This is a system that has a lot of loud tools. Yanquiel Fernandez has some of the biggest power of any prospect. You talk to scouts from outside the organization, they love him. If there's a player that they could acquire in trade, it's Fernandez. And they think there's some things that maybe they could do that the Rockies don't do. So that's all sort of part of trade targets and how scouts look at this. But you get a lot higher praise on him than what you think. And then they added some of the best stuff in the draft in Brody Breck, though I have my questions as to how that projects out. It's an interesting system from 1 through 30. And I know that we've heard that from scouts around the game that cover this team and see it. And I know Josh Norris has kind of echoed those sentiments as well. Every time I update this top 30, I have 2 or 3 names that scouts send me. They're like, hey, this guy could maybe be on the list. That their 31 through 40 has a lot of guys that would be in the 15 to 25 range in a large chunk of systems. There's a lot of depth here. Part of that is they've drafted exciting, tooled up players. I think they go after athletes. Another part of it is they don't make trades with prospects, so they kind of just compound.
It's funny because when we recorded the NL Central and we talked about how the Brewers keep winning on these trades, and this is one thing I think that has been a problem for the Rockies is like when they traded Nolan Arenado, you've got to get something really good back in that. And Austin Gomber's been the best thing they got. El Huris Montero's kind of been up and down. Mateo Gil, Tony Losi, Jake Summers, like they whiffed on that. Like, again, you want more than a number 5 starter, which is, I think you could maybe argue Gomber's been a 4, but he's really probably more of a 5. But the thing that does jump out to me now when you talk about this, and again, I don't think that this is enough in this division, but you can now look at this and say, and I don't want to give false hope because this never turns out this way, but when you look at what they have at the big league level already, where you would say, okay, who's kind of your core you're building around? And I would say, well, Brenton Doyle is absolutely, I would say at this point, a core player because, I mean, I know he's on a tear right now offensively, but when you combine the defense with that, you feel really good about him. And I would say that you would say that McMahon, Tovar, and Rogers kind of fit in that as well. But not all of them even necessarily. You could end up moving, some of these are not kind of stars, but these are solid players. But then when you look at this, okay, well, if Condon can play third base, or even if he's in a left spot, okay, he shouldn't be that far away, right? You said you got Romo coming at catcher, who's not far away at all, although his aggressiveness may lead to some trouble in the big league level and adjustments, because the man does not walk at all. But he's a really good catcher defensively. You've got Beck, who's reached the majors. You got Amador, to be your second baseman long term if Brendan Rodgers isn't. You've got Fernandez, Veen, and Beck for the outfield. You said you've got Carrig, who's not that far away. You've got this rotation, front of the rotation guy in Dollander. Palmquist not that far away. You are right. Like, there's a lot here that could arrive pretty soon. Now, some of these guys are going to be less than we hope that they will be. That always happens. But that's at least something where the Rockies have a chance to be a young and interesting team for the first time in quite a while. That probably gets them to being a 75 win team, at least, if this clicks at least a little bit, as opposed to kind of where they are right now, which is far from that. And they're kind of far from that. And, again, the other frustration with it is if you're a Rockies fan, is they're kind of far from that. And we talked when we were doing the Central, like, if you have an O'Neill Cruz, even Ellie De La Cruz, you have guys like that, you get really excited. It's like, okay, it's a fun day at the ballpark. Rockies have had kind of some non-fun teams for a while. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that you can look at this team and you can look at some of the young players that are there and some of the young players that are coming up. I think Ezequiel Tovar is a pretty exciting player. What they've been able to do with Brenton Doyle, a D2 guy taken in the fourth round that always could pick it. I mean, one of the best outfield defenders I've seen in the minor leagues, and I saw him for a good chunk of time in 2022 as he played 123 games with Hartford. So he was there for like the entire year. Last year, you saw, the best defensive outfielder per the metrics, was still a non-negative WAR player, despite being the worst hitter. I mean, a 43 WRC plus. He's been a league average hitter this year, is having a 2020 season hitting 265, 325, 470 with 20 homers and 22 stolen bases as we record this, while providing elite center field defense. He's a pretty exciting player. If Nolan Jones is healthy and we get a return back to what Nolan Jones was in 2023, he can be a really exciting player. So I think that the ingredients are here for an interesting offense and players that, can, I don't think they're going to go toe to toe with the Dodgers, but can hit. Like, this could be a lineup in a year we're going back on it saying, hey, they got all these guys up to the major leagues. They took a step forward. We have seen some of these guys like Tovar, Doyle, Jones that have taken a step forward within the Rockies organization. We do have to give them some credit there. And overall, they've done a pretty good job over the years of developing big league regular positional players, right? You look at the lineup now, it's majority homegrown guys outside of like Chris Bryant, and I guess Elias Diaz, but he's out of contract this year and it might be Romo or whoever. They've done a pretty good job there. They've gotten a lot out of players that maybe weren't necessarily high pedigree day one draft types too. It's just a matter of for them, and it's always been the same story for 25 years. Can they figure out the pitching side of things? They have some talent now in the organization. They have a bunch of weird lefties with interesting arm slots and some of that stuff. And they've kind of leaned in on the two extremes of really high slot pitchers that can create really steep plane, and then lower slot pitchers that, create flat plane. And I think that's interesting. It seemed like they have some direction they didn't have before, just in terms of maybe some philosophy that you can kind of see, as opposed to just signing a bunch of college performers who throw 90. They've kind of figured that out a little bit. It's just a matter of, does that follow those players to the major league level? Do they have enough success to sustain in this division and just be competitive? I could see this being a really interesting lineup in a year, though. I'll give them credit there that I do think there's some elements of this system and what they have working at the major league level that they could take another step forward next year and kind of be watchable, which they really haven't been for a bunch of years. I mean, last year was the worst year in the history of the Rockies in terms of their actual record. That was the worst Rockies team of all time.
again, the goals are modest right now. 75 wins. If they can get to 75 wins, that'll be the first time that they are a 75 win team since 2018. And I throw 2020 obviously as a short season, but they weren't on pace to win 75 games that year either. So like they won 74 in 2021. Like 75 wins is a next step that they are far from in recent years. Last year and this year, they are far from that. But that doesn't seem that crazy to get to there before too long. Well, that's the only team in the NL West for whom 75 wins is a goal that everyone can feel like is a potentially obtainable, but also a goal. For everyone else, 75 wins is a disappointment. And we're back. And if you're watching on the YouTube version of this, you may go, wait a second, they look a little different than they did about 5 seconds ago. But yes, if you're on the podcast, you don't know what we're talking about here, but yes, we are recording this second half on another day. Geoff's actually in a different state than he was when we recorded the first two of these NL West teams, because he's seeing Travis Bazzana, Ralphie Velasquez, the Lake Planet Guardians versus the Great Lake Loons. So he's getting to see some really good baseball. But speaking of perfect timing, because we're talking about the Dodgers, who are a team that, as usual, is right in the midst of the fight for the best record in the National League, is basically also, I would say, I guess we'll start with the bad and then get to the good, is battling an incredible run of pitching injuries, Geoff. I would say we have the news now that River Ryan is going to miss the rest of this year and likely all of next year, having Tommy John surgery, which is unfortunately for Dodgers fans not an unusual occurrence with them right now. And so I guess I'll start with this question, like that's kind of worth us talking about a little bit, I think, because it's pretty timely, which is there something that the Dodgers do you think, that leaves them more prone to this? Or is this, and again, there are no easy answers on these things, but I saw quotes from Dodgers officials said, everyone battles with this. And I would say that's true. I would say the Dodgers, in my opinion, may battle this a little bit more than some others, but I think that there's a logical reason for that, which is I feel like that the Dodgers, much like the Braves, are willing to accept a little bit more injury risk. And the return for that is you're talking about top tier pitchers. Like, again, to use a Braves example, Spencer Strider. You draft Spencer Strider coming off of Tommy John surgery. Spencer Strider dominates almost immediately. Is basically one of the best pitchers in the National League from the moment he arrives. As a reliever, then as a starter, and then he blows out again. And you say, okay, well, this is kind of the balance you're fighting. The Dodgers also do this. The Dodgers drafted Walker Buehler, who was having an arm injury, and Walker Buehler came back from that and was one of the better pitchers in the National League. And then he had another arm injury. And we could say, Dustin May has great stuff when he's healthy. Unfortunately, he hasn't been healthy very much. And we can now add River Ryan, and we could add Evan Sheehan, and we can do a long list of this. But Geoff, how do you view it? Is this something that they've got to fix, or is this something where it's kind of like, this is the risk that comes with when you keep developing top end arms?
I think it's a balance. I think it was a similar conversation we had a year ago about the Rays, just in terms of the amount of arms that they've had, high-end arms they've had that have blown out, guys that took a big jump in stuff like a Jeffrey Springs. And I think some of it, to kind of steal an analogy from the auto world, is I feel like it's your buddy who puts, a ton of work into his Mustang every year. The specs on the engine and all the things that he's done to that car, the exhaust, et cetera, are great. It runs like a dream for 2 months, and then something goes wrong again. And then it's back up on the lift for another 2 months. I feel like they optimize, and it's pretty consistent with the Rays and the Braves and some of these other organizations you're bringing up here, where they optimize these guys to an extreme. And I know it's kind of an old school thing, and certainly kind of is a departure from my typical focus on stuff and measurable, traits and numbers and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes I think, perhaps they go too far in terms of developing velocity. We'll use the term spin loosely, but I think it's more shape. But optimizing some of these pitchers, I think it does raise some of the risk level, just in terms of trying to get, every last, bit of, blood from the stone, so to speak. It's like, I think that can lead to better results, better overall prospects, more interesting pitchers, better stuff. But I think it can also lead to, higher risk of injury. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a trainer. I don't have a medical degree. So me speaking on this is just, conjecture to a degree. But I do think that, there's been some smoke in that area of, the type of pitchers that continually have elbow issues, blow out. It's the guys with the good stuff. We see that so consistently. That being said, I think it's a worthy risk for organization and player. It's a reason that teams and players have gone this direction, because the results ultimately, if you get a guy like that for 2 or 3 healthy seasons, can be phenomenal. It's just a matter of trying to balance health. And I think we just still don't know. Should they throw more? Should they throw less? How is that all going to work? So it's an interesting topic. It's certainly something that's relevant right now to the conversation around the Dodgers. At the same time, I don't want to blame them straight out, because I think we see this consistently throughout the game. And they do turn a lot of guys that maybe aren't the highest, upside amateurs into something that we didn't necessarily expect they were going to be. I mean, River Ryan was a two-way guy that was drafted, by the Padres almost as an afterthought. They get him as, more or less a throw-in a trade. Though I'm sure the Dodgers knew what they were doing. They scout as well as anybody. And then that guy turns into one of the best pitching prospects in the minor leagues. I mean, some of the hyperbole you were hearing over the last month or so, prior to him making his major league debut, was, I think this guy's a top 5 pitching prospect right now. And it was justified just based on the stuff, what the results were. But I still think you have to come back to, when evaluating pitching prospects, it's a war of attrition. And I was having this conversation actually here in Lake County with a scout, somebody who had a lot of experience in the game. And it was something that we were kind of talking about, if like, it might be easier for pitchers to get up to the major leagues than it's ever been, simply because there's less levels, there's less competition, and there's so much turnover and churn and burn in terms of rotations, with so many pitchers getting injured, that sometimes it's, these guys like, Christian Scott's not a great example because he's now injured, but sometimes it's these guys that maybe aren't first round picks, aren't the guys like the Jackson Jobs, the types that were hyping up around stuff. It's the guys that throw a bunch of innings, they compete, that, I'm starting to gravitate more toward like these Quinn Matthews types of arms, where they're guys that showed that they can throw a lot of innings, they can handle a big workload, and then they come to pro ball, the nutrition's better, focus on training is better, just the way the season lays out, and they're able to sort of add a couple of ticks, add some stuff. And I think the thing that we can probably agree on is the hardest part of pitching, just like with hitting in terms of contact, you can have big power, you can have all that. Bat to ball skills are still something that I think is somewhat innate, and it's tough to really improve in that area. It's tough to learn how to pitch in the minor leagues. It's tough to have that sort of competitive environment that you see in college baseball. It's why so many of the good starters do still come through the college route, because I think they play in big games that matter all throughout the season, whether you win or lose from week to week. There's, fans, coaches, people's jobs depend on it. It's a little different in the minor leagues. You can be a guy that goes out there and throws these 4-inning starts and piggybacks with somebody else, and you show great stuff and your K numbers are awesome. But at the end of the day, you kind of got to round it back to like, can this guy get through the lineup twice? And there's just not a lot of guys with good stuff that we see in the minor leagues that have been developed to pitch and get through the lineup to, get that third time, 5-6 innings. I think in terms of like pitching evaluation when it comes to prospects, I'm leaning more and more toward the guys that can show me consistently that they can go 5 or 6 innings. And the Dodgers have kind of been on the forefront, kind of rounding this back because I went on a tangent, round this back a little bit. The Dodgers have been on the forefront of a lot of these guys that maybe they baby a little bit in the minor leagues in terms of how they roll them out. I think we saw that with Walker Buehler, which worked initially, and then he's really back on health. And then we saw it with Ryan, we saw it with Bobby Miller.
Clayton
And I don't
Beeter was
know.
an extreme example to me. Clayton Beeter was like Mr. 1 to 2 inning guy before they traded him for a long time.
Yeah. And I don't think, Beater maybe talent wise isn't quite on the tier of some of those other guys. But still, like, yeah, I think that's kind of a big question mark, a bigger question mark with pitchers now that you can have great stuff. You can have all the K rates in the world. It looks beautiful. When you dig into the data, you get excited about it. But, at the end of the day, major league teams need guys that go 5 to 6 innings every time they go out and can battle. And, they can get you 7 innings, amazing. I know we talked about this, I think, in the last podcast. And I just think that's the bigger question mark when you're evaluating some of these Dodgers. Yeah, they all have good stuff. They're all really interesting. How many of these guys can work deep into games? I think Jackson Ferris might be one of those guys. He seems to get a little bit deeper into games, particularly toward the end of his stint with Great Lakes. Was getting 5, 6, 7 inning starts.
To give just a background on this, like what we're talking about, like if you look at the Dodgers IL right now, you literally have more than a rotation. And I'm talking about kind of homegrown guys. I'm leaving out the Ryan Braziers of the world now, but Walker Buehler, Tony Gonsolin, Dustin May, River Ryan, Emmett Sheehan, and Yamamoto, who they signed this year. That doesn't count Kyle Hurt, who's on the full season IL in the minors. And that doesn't count, again, some other guys that we could bring up over recent years. Bobby Miller's obviously had injuries this year. But at the same time, like as we kind of tie this to kind of the state of the organization, they're also much like the Braves. This is the team doing it. You made the point that a lot of the guys that we're talking about here are guys who weren't top 10, top 15 picks. The Dodgers don't pick in the top 15. The Dodgers pick at the back of the first round every year. And a lot of these guys we're talking about are guys who were later round picks, were guys who kind of entered pro ball as like, oh, that guy's interesting, but we'll see. And then ends up being someone who turns into something and then gets hurt. So it's kind of a balance. And I don't know, again, durability is an important part of this. But at the same time, if you help the guy become a big leaguer, a big league starter who wouldn't have been a big league starter, it's a tricky balance. Okay, but saying that, I do think we talk often about the Dodgers and how impressive their player development is. I do feel like right now, at the minor league level, at the state of the farm system, I would say that it is a little thinner at the top than it's been in quite a while. That doesn't mean they're not still extremely deep. Doesn't mean they don't have a whole lot of interesting prospects. But when you talk about, normally they've had 1 or 2 like top 25, top 50 type prospects. That's where I think they're a little bit lacking right now. Is that fair, Jeff?
Yeah, I think, there's a handful of hitters here that I think we've been kind of waiting to make the jump. It's starting to happen, I think, with a few of them. It's still a lot of depth. They've had, some unfortunate injuries to like Zaire Hope missed a good chunk of the season. I think if he had been on the field and healthy for the first 3 months of the year, he's a guy that probably pushes into our top 100 list, maybe pushes higher. He's at 5 in the system now. But could be a guy that could push even higher, just in terms of what his skills are, what he was showing early. And there's some younger players. I think that's a big part of it too, is there's a lot of guys that are low A, complex level guys, recent draftees, that have the opportunity to sort of push into that top 50 area if things go right. It's just a matter of, how all of that sort of plays out. It's still a very deep system. You can go 1 through 30 here. And I think, writing this top 30 for the handbook, I'll say, would probably be pretty exciting because you'd be writing about a lot of fun, interesting players. And with our job, that's something that we definitely look forward to as we hit the doldrums of late fall into early winter as we're putting together the handbook. So there's depth here. And I think, I had this conversation yesterday in terms of where they rank out, because I think they were 11 or 12. I think they were 12 in our in our top 30 rankings of the different systems. And I don't think it's a depth issue. If we weighted depth a little bit more than we do in our equation, and not so much in the high end prospects, which makes sense because those are the guys that turn into average or better big leaguers, right? Like we've seen that play out for many, many years. It's the reason that we use the number and the equation that we do. I think they probably would rank a little bit higher because they're probably deeper than 4 or 5 systems that are ahead of them in these rankings at minimum. Because they do such a good job of identification in college, high school, international side, even some of these guys they trade for and acquire. And then just, they kind of turn over every stone. I feel like they have a big scouting department. That's what they do well. So it maybe ranks a little bit lower than usual, but I think that's just because of not having those 1 or 2 high-end guys that really kind of push the rankings up a little bit. So it's still a good system. Maybe there's not the superstar lurking that you would hope.
Okay. I mean, I think it's actually the top end. The interesting part is there is a fun Jose DePaula, Dalton Rushing debate. Which one do you like? I think that DePaula has kind of, the upside to dream on, but at the same time, we have Rushing higher, and I think that's really because Rushing's knocking on the door. Rushing's in AAA now. It is interesting he's playing left field. I don't think that that's as much a knock. My perception is it's not as much a knock on his long-term potential catcher as the fact that now that he's in AAA, they have a catcher. I mean, they have a franchise catcher who's locked up for a long time. So if Dalton Rushing is going to play regularly, he needs to find another position. How do you kind of view the Dalton Rushing path?
Yeah, I think the catching has improved since his time as an amateur. The throwing is okay. The receiving still kind of questionable, but I think like you can look at him and say that this guy can get to an average-ish, fringe average defensive catcher, which with his bat is kind of all you need, as long as he's, not really bad back there, can handle the pitching staff, isn't making, 3 or 4 boo-boos a week in terms of letting stuff get by him. As long as that stuff, which I do think they've done a good job of cleaning up, since he was at Louisville and then out, on the Cape, when I saw a lot of Dalton Rushing. And the bat is pretty special, and he's delivering. And actually, I would even argue probably underperforming a little bit based on the underlying data. He was one of the guys I think I wrote about a week or 2 back. And, the underlying numbers have been pretty outstanding this year, just in terms of his balance of bat to ball skills, approach, and then just excellent power and the ability to, elevate consistently. Combined between AA and AAA, is hitting 268, 381, 497 at the time of recording this. Only a 20% K rate, 12% walk rate, 17 homers. He's hitting for power. And I think that's really that's the selling point here is this is a really well-rounded bat that could fit at a variety of positions. If you have to put him in left field, fine. If he's a first baseman some days, fine. DH, spells Will Smith as a catcher. I think it's that positional versatility that's going to get him to the big leagues, and his ability to maybe play a few spots at like a fringe average level defensively and then provide a lot of value with the bat. And, I think that's what Rushing kind of is as a prospect.
The crazy part about that is that if this was most teams, you'd be saying, okay, well, what position, is he best at, whatever. It's like, but this is the Dodgers. So when you said that, I'm thinking, okay, he's not going to DH much because they have Shohei Ohtani. And he's not going to play first base much because they have Freddie Freeman. And he's not going to play catcher much because they have Will Smith. So left field does make sense here because every one of these other positions is blocked by an all-star, like as far as your primary playing time there, which, to be the Dodgers. That is who we are talking about. The Dodgers are able to do that at a level that most are not. The one, as we segue over to the Padres, the other team that does try to do this, I will say, is the Padres. Now, they can't spin at the level that the Dodgers can, but they have spin. And it is a fascinating approach. The Padres, under A.J. Preller, there is no one they will not trade, especially in the farm system. And they do seem to have kind of an approach where they're not about depth. They're about adding potential stars because potential stars either play for you or more likely are the guys that they're the ammunition to trade for the next guy they need to trade for. The trades they've done so far have really seem to have paid off this year. Like the Padres are one of the hottest, as we record this, are one of the hottest teams in baseball. They are now 15 games over 500 as we record this, and have basically been. I mean, this is a team that was 50-50 on July 19th. So when you say like 15 games over 500, they have gone on a tear. Joe Musgrove is back, but the moves that they made, the trades that they made, are really helping the big league club. Jackson Merrill, homegrown guy who is developing into a very young, a 21-year-old star. Guys like that have been crucial for them. That said, it does leave a farm system, Jeff, that it's Ethan Salas and Leo DeVries at the top, and hey, they just drafted some guys like Cash Mayfield, but other than that, it's as thin as I can remember it, is the way I would put it.
Yeah. But the thing with the Padres, and I feel like we say this year after year, is they make, they have their draft, they make their trades at the deadline. It seems like the cupboard is barren. And then we come back to the table in May, June of next year. And some of those draft guys have turned out to be really good value. And so it'll be interesting to see, how this draft class sort of develops over the next 6 to 8 months. And if that sort of can continue to backfill, because they've done a nice job of that. And, I think we continually come back to it and go, all right, well, this guy's better than we thought. This guy should move a little bit higher. This guy's performing. And they have these, 5 or 6 prospects at the top of their system that are all very good assets, very tradable assets that they're then able to move to, bring in more major league stars. And I think, you look at this lineup and this rotation, and they've done that a few times. They went out and they got Michael King in December of last year. They added Dylan Cease before the season in March. Early in the season, they added Luis Arias, who I think, gives them another element at the top of their lineup, and so on and so forth. So they continue to do this over and over again, while, bringing some homegrown guys up to fill into different roles, whoever that might be. So I think, credit to AJ Preller, who I think if, you rated his skills in a 2080 sort of format, his greatest skill is identifying amateur players that, can potentially become better players in pro ball. We've seen it so long for so many years. And it's one of those things that, like, on paper now, it looks like a pretty bad system. But I also don't want to dismiss it in the sense that we've seen this movie before, and we could come back to this in a few months and say, oh, well, Cash Mayfield is one of the better young pitching prospects in baseball. And, Boston Bateman looks pretty good, or, Tyson Neighbors or Cale Fontaine. Like there's a bunch of players here that I think could, turn out to be really interesting. Is it Cale Fountain or Fontaine?
I think it's Fountain, but I could be. Right. Me and pronunciations are not good friends.
My problem was growing up watching too much hockey with like French Canadian players and having a high French Canadian population where I grew up in Massachusetts. So that name could go either way.
But the way I would put it with all of this is it's designed not to have depth as much, right? Like It is designed. Like the other thing I'll say, by the time we roll around to next April, there will be another premium international signee who's, one of the best players from that class. Because the thing that the Padres do, like if you look at their 30 right now, on our site, they have Ethan Salas, who, we're going to do a lot of digging in the offseason. Like we kind of he's a very hard player to evaluate right now, I would say, because he is exceptionally young for the level he is at. He still has really good tools. He's also not had a very good year. Leo DeVries had a struggle in the first half, really kind of turned it on, has kind of caught up to the California League. But the thing I would say about those are the guys that they signed. Those were the top guys, 2 of the top guys from the past 2 international classes. That's how they sign them. Like they go all in on getting a guy in the international market, not we're going to get this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy. And so what that ends up meaning is that if you look at their lower levels, we've talked to scouts who say like there's not a whole lot there, like as far as the second guy, the third guy, the fourth guy. Now it's Leo DeVries, but then it's not. That's not where they're going for. Like they are going for, hey, we're not looking for role. We're not looking for up and down guys. We're not looking for role players. We're looking for guys who we can hit home runs with. Sometimes we're going to strike out, but if we hit a home run on it, we're going to then that's Jackson Merrill or that's James Wood, who right away was not a first round pick, but who was able to be a key part of acquiring Juan Soto. Or that's how you get, again, we can just go down the list with them, but that's what they keep doing. It is working for them. Now, obviously, you want to see them have a little bit more postseason success, but I will say it's hard to ignore the fact that here they are, and they look like a near playoff lock at this point, you would think, or extremely likely to be a playoff team. Let's put it that way. And they are positioned that if everything works right, I mean, they're not a team you want to face in the postseason either. So, but I will say you hit on it. I think we both kind of really like this draft as far as guys who could really pop again for a team that's not picking at the top, of the draft. I think that there's a lot of kind of interesting guys in this. You kind of went through some of them. I do think there still are some other pitchers here who will be kind of interesting to see how they develop. The other thing with the Padres is they're one of the organizations that push guys. They like to push guys fast, and some guys think, some guys swim. If they swim, it also ups their trade value. Let's be clear, like the way models work and all. This is not entirely model based, but if you perform and put up good analytical numbers while performing in a league where you're 2, 3, 4 years younger than the average player in that league, that's going to pop, right?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that's sort of the difficult thing with like evaluating an Ethan Salas is he's played so far above sort of his age to level that it's difficult to sort of take a step back and say, like, should I be concerned about this? Is this just growing pains with a young prospect who's, playing way above his head in terms of, the experience that he has? And he had such a good, initial ascent into pro ball that, you don't necessarily know, like, is he the guy from last year? Is he the guy from this year? Is there something in between? And I think that's one of the tougher things with the Padres, because they are aggressive in assigning some of these young players. We saw it with, Leo DeVries, of course, this year. He struggled at first, has really come into his own. And, I think the lesson is kind of the Sebastian Walcott one, where he was really bad over the first 2 months of the season, was really, kind of struggling in high A, and then sort of got his sea legs. And since then has been one of the best players in the South Atlantic League for the better part of 2.5 months now. So sometimes it's just small things that need to click. The thing that Salas for me, I always fall back on is the defense is good. The receiving is so smooth. And especially for a player that's that young, even for your college catchers, the minor leagues and learning the position and all the rigors of your responsibilities as a catcher in pro ball are a little different, and he kind of already has that. So it's just a matter of the bat gets back to what we thought it was a year ago. This guy could be a big bounce back prospect in 2025. And I think it's one of the reasons that we've been cautious in pushing him down the board in our top 100 rankings, despite the numbers not being great.
Right. And that is an example of one where we're not hearing from scouts yet, oh, this guy's write him off. Or, I mean, not write him off, but like there's real giant concerns here. It's more of like, yeah, he looks like he's a little bit over his head is what we seem to be hearing more. And that's one where it's like, okay, I'm not ready to, I'm not ready to, I don't think we're ready to kind of make any big decisions off of that yet. Well, again, that's going to be a fun off-season discussion. But that leads us to our final NL West and our final of you going through all 30 of these orgs. Like, this has been kind of fun going through this. Again, if you haven't listened to all of these, we have, by the time this one's up, they're all up on Baseball America on our podcast feed, but also and this is the last one going up on YouTube as well. But when we look at the Giants, Geoff, I don't know whether to say, is this bad? I can't say it's bad when you're talking about a team that is sitting at 500 as we record this, who really is kind of pretty well positioned now that Blake Snell is pitching like Blake Snell again. Now that you have kind of everyone healthy, has had, I would say, at the big league level, some really positive developments this year. Elliot Ramos has kind of the post-hype prospect who's living up to the hype. I mean, he's been really good this year. They've gotten Patrick Bailey gives them. He's a perfectly solid catcher. Never going to be Buster Posey, but he gives them a nice young catcher to build around. Tyler Fitzgerald, that's one where I kind of shake my head a little bit and go, can he keep this up? I don't know, but he has done it. Like this counts. Those 13 homers, they don't go away. So, like, to his credit, he's been really good. They've got Marco Luciano kind of, still kind of on that periphery of being ready to help, although they don't know where defensively. But what I'm saying is they've managed to work in some guys to go with what has been a pretty veteran-heavy team. And then you say on the farm system, I don't think it's a great, top 10, but I also don't think it's a terrible top 10. I kind of like that they got Tibbs and Jordan. Those are two guys who I think are, Jordan's going to hit for power. We'll see if he's got really good tools. It's all about contact with him. But I think Tibbs is kind of the perfect counterpoint to that. Whereas, I feel like pretty good about the fact that James Tibbs is probably going to be a pretty solid hitter. But what's your take on kind of where the Giants farm system is here in August of 2024?
Yeah, I think you can look at this team, and for me, there's kind of two very clear directions that they go, and they're sort of divergent in terms of philosophy. I think you look at their position prospects and they go for loud tools and upside, right? You look at Bryce Eldridge, loud power, some of probably the biggest raw power of any player, 20 years or younger in the game. Marco Luciano kind of falls into that same sort of category, a little bit older, but tons of power there. Tibbs is a guy that can hit. He's got power, the ability to consistently backspin it to his pull side. You just mentioned Dakota Jordan. Really, really loud tools there. And then you look at the pitching side of things, and I feel like they have a lot of college guys that know how to compete, get deeper into starts, get outs consistently. Hayden Birdsong has been really good at the major league level. We saw them sort of do something similar with a guy like Logan Webb, who didn't have as much prospect pedigree, but has turned into a pretty good arm. And then just, some of the other names that you kind of go throughout the system. Carson Wisenhunt, I think, he's got good stuff, but it's not like a huge stuff guy. His thing was, having that great changeup, really good feel for his arsenal, being able to attack, at least in college, get deeper into starts. Mason Black, I think, is similar. Joe Whitman is kind of similar. Landon Raup. So there's a handful of guys here that kind of fall into that category, and they've done a pretty good job of developing some of these arms into starters. I know Kyle Harrison's a little bit different, just in terms of, the control and command was not great in the minor leagues. It's gotten better. He's pitched a full season in the majors and, has looked really good at points in time. So maybe there's more to be said here about their pitching development, especially, on the Harrison point. This is a guy that had double-digit-ish walk rates throughout his minor league career. Last year in his sample size, 7.5% walk rate. That was over 34 and 2/3 innings. And now over 111 innings this year, 7.6% walk rate. So they've kind of rounded out some of that command with Harrison as well. It's not a standout top 10. You have what?
I would say Carson Wisenhunt's the next one up on that they need to do the same thing with.
There's three players here that in the top 100 that I think are really good in Eldridge. Luciano, who it's been an uneven progression through the minor leagues for Luciano, to say the least. But I think the skills and ability are still there. He's a guy that was pushed a little bit aggressively and dealt with some injuries and had to make up some time. And then you see Birdsong and what he's done at the major league level. And there's some interesting players, throughout this system. Is it one of the best top 10s in the game in terms of the 30 organizations? No. But I still think there's some players here. There's some interest. There's some hitters. And then you have a guy like Reggie Crawford where kind of the sky's the limit. It's just a matter of what his role is going to be long term. I've kind of always leaned that it's going to be a reliever probably, but a really good one-inning reliever because of what the stuff is. And he's left-handed, and there's just not a lot of guys with that power from the left side. And then they've had some interesting international players. Reiner Arias is one right now that's kind of up here. And then a guy like Walker Martin, which kind of falls into that bucket of really tooled up players. And this is funny. Last episode of the 90th percentile, which will come out on Friday of this week, Matt Pajak, my co-host, who part of his profession is running athletic testing and running the actual run test, jump test, etc., for a variety of players. He called out Tyler Fitzgerald as a guy who was a really good athlete, was a good player at Louisville, maybe a little bit underrated. And now we're seeing that athleticism kind of turn into production at the major league level. So maybe that's a reason to go back to your previous comment to believe in Fitzgerald a little bit more. But I think it kind of falls in that bucket of them being really into the toolsy guys that maybe have a little bit more upside, a little bit more athleticism. One of the topics on this podcast is how guys with more athleticism, as that stuff begins to atrophy, they don't necessarily slow down as much as some of the other players that maybe are teeter-tottering on like average to fringe average athleticism. I think it's kind of
versus young player skills. Like this is the thing going back to the 80s. This is like if your value is built on walks and power, those players often, those players often age a little quicker than the players who their value is built on kind of a well-rounded 5 tools, because as that starts to decline, your skills keep going up as your tools keep going down. It's like the never-ending fight, I think, in baseball. But if your skill level keeps going up, but your tools were already here, okay, you may have to move down the defensive spectrum. Yeah, but if you start at shortstop and then you end up being a second baseman, you're still good. Whereas if you started at first base and now you're a DH, then just a little tough, all these things. And Fitzgerald is kind of that athlete who does that. I do want to, one thing you said about Crawford, when you talk about role, the big thing I think more than anything is we just don't know that Reggie Crawford can pitch we want to see him pitch for 3 months at some point in some season. Because if we remember his background, right? Like we talk about him as a two-way guy, but this guy was a hitter who then showed his arm in a great summer, but it was like the blink of an eye, and then he blew out, and he was drafted on the possibilities of that arm, and then he went out and threw 19 innings in 23, which is not a particularly heavy workload, but he was coming off of Tommy John surgery. And here we are, he's on the IL with general arm fatigue this year, and he's thrown 18 innings in 24. The biggest thing beyond anything else is we've just got to see, like when Reggie Crawford's on the mound, he needs to work on his control, things like that. But more than anything, I mean, this is a guy who needs to show he can eat, and I don't mean eat innings in the 150 inning manner. I mean eat innings as in like he had 15 innings in a month, kind of that manner, or 10. And the worry I have with that is like, as good as his stuff is, when we add up his total innings, probably, at least going back to college, let's not go back to high school and all, but high school, college on, we're still under 100 innings, I think.
I think we're well under 100 innings because
He's 37 in pro ball. If you add up everything, I think we're well under 100. And the problem with that, I would say, is as good as Gerard is like there are things that you pick up from being on the mound. And like if you told me that Reggie Crawford's a little further away than we may think, I know he's reached AAA, but if you told me he's a little further away because he just hasn't had many opportunities on the mound ever, it does stand out.
I mean, he threw 2 innings. I happened to see one of them on the Cape with Bourne. He threw 6 in a third the previous summer in 2020 with Westfield in the Futures Collegiate League. In total, between college, where he threw 8 innings total for Connecticut, his summer ball, his pro numbers. So this dates back to 2022. He's thrown 53 and 2/3 innings. So it's a little bit over half of 100. Like, that's the number of innings he's thrown in the last 4 years is the amount of innings that we want to see him throw in a season. Just him throwing 55 innings and coming out of the bullpen in 1 inning stints. At this point, that's I think we'd all take that. And it kind of goes back to the conversation we had right after the break about the Dodgers, where you can have all the stuff in the world, but if you're not out there and competing and taking the ball consistently, it's a big question mark as to what the future is going to look like.
And let's say this is the Giants. The Giants are actually a team that has, as you noted, has also focused very strongly on guys who can kind of give you that they very much value, I think, the innings component of this. I mean, okay, we were talking about Blake Snell, but even in Blake Snell's case, like, hey, he threw an honest to goodness complete game no hitter for them. Like, Blake Snell does, I love how Blake Snell said it's like, see, I can pitch tonight. But you look at what Logan Webb's value, part of his value is you are getting innings from him. Kyle Harrison has developed into a guy who gives you innings. I would say that, again, Hayden Birdsong's had some rocky moments, but he's a 22-year-old who reached the big leagues. And I think you feel good about his chance to give you innings. This is a team that kind of does a pretty good job of developing that. The toughest thing they have, the biggest battle they have is they're in a division with the D-backs and the Padres, and then the big bad monster, which is the Dodgers. And, if they were sitting here at, 61 and 61, and they were in the, if they were in the Central, they would be tied with the Cardinals for second. If they were in the East, they would be fourth, but they would be right there. And you put them in this division, and it's like, okay, it's going to be hard to catch the D-backs or the Padres or the Dodgers. We'll see. Again, this team is well positioned to make a nice little run in September. But so to wrap this up, to put a bow on it, is anything that jumps out to you now that we've just over the last week basically talked about all 30 organizations? Anyone that came away from you were like, oh, that organization, like, now they're diving, just talking about it, made me think like they're a little better, a little worse, or anything that came, any trends, anything that stood out to you, like, hey, this is something interesting we haven't gotten to cover.
Yeah, I think coming off of the draft, I was actually pretty impressed with the Nationals. I think they have some pitching prospects that have performed really well. Travis Sikora being one that I think will probably move up in our offseason rankings or the next time that we update.
You will definitely move up the next time we rank.
Yeah, but overall, I think you kind of look at that system and say, like, they have some interesting players in the top half of the system. That system, I think, is probably better than I thought. It was kind of remarkable, kind of on the opposite side of things, how shallow the Pirate system really looks outside of a couple of interesting prospects at the top, considering how high that they've been drafting over the last several years. So I think that's another one, like, kind of on the negative side that sticks out to me a little bit. And then, the Tampa Bay Rays. I think the Rays system got better at the trade deadline. And there's a reason it ranks as our number 2 farm system. Will probably be number 1 pretty soon when some of those Orioles top prospects like Holiday, et cetera, graduate.
And maybe stay there even after Caminero. But Caminero graduating will obviously hurt the Rays too.
Yes, but they have, I think, a little bit more runway in terms of that happening, because he may not graduate this year.
I think I would say that it's at this point, considering that he did get some service time last year and some at bats, he came up early enough that I would say, like, they would have to work hard to keep him from graduating this year. I would say that. Like, Matt Daddy and I were having a conversation about yesterday, because one of the things that does stand out is we've talked about, he's at 38 at bats right now. When you consider it's mid-August, like he needs less than 100. That's going to be hard for him not to get to, unless they're really platooning him. But it is. But even without him, they still will have Carson Williams and Xavier Isaac, and really, again, a revitalized pitching development. I would say, adding a Brody Hopkins to a Gary Gilhill and a San Diego Suarez. A lot of
Harrison as well. That's another one.
Trevor Harrison. There's a lot there, but. So we hope you've enjoyed this. We have kind of covered now all 30 teams. If you've missed any of them, they're all up here at the Baseball America podcast feed, but also we're also on our YouTube channel at Baseball America. If you can, subscribe, leave a review. That helps more people see these. Get some, I don't know. Some of you, it's like this is your little secret weapon, in your fantasy or your sim league. So even in that case, you can still comment or something. Maybe the other people in your league won't see it. But with that, we thank you as our subscribers as always, because the Baseball America subscribers let us do what we're doing. That's why Jeff can be in Lake County seeing one of the top draft prospects making his, very early in his pro career, which is the kind of stuff that we also need to do so that we can give you the best rankings that we can give you. That, that's what we work on all year round, rankings reports and all that. So that's what we love to do too. So for Jeff, I'm JJ. So long, everybody.